And we're back, baby. Hey, fam. We're officially back from our Japan holiday, and I'm probably going to do some kind of post-video roundup for that. But I want to keep. Hey, Tizzy. I want to keep my streak going and stay reporting on books that I read. Obviously, in the months of October and November, when we were doing our big Japan trip, we were traveling around Japan with family. Didn't have as much time to read, but I did have some. So we're going to smash those 2 months together, and I'm just going to give you the rundown of everything I read in the month. First up, I read Madonna in a Fur Coat by Sabahattin. I haven't read nearly as many Middle Eastern authors as I wanted to in my life, so I'm trying to correct that. And this is a classic. This is apparently a Turkish classic. And it was beautiful. It was kind of a quintessential Bildungsroman, coming of age, first love, tragedy. I don't feel like I'm spoiling anything. This book's been out for decades. But it was beautifully written. Obviously, I read it in English, so there might have been something lost in translation, but I really enjoyed it. So if you're looking to dip your toes into Middle Eastern literature, but you want more modern stuff, not just, classical Islamic texts or poetry or something like that, but, 20th century writing, really recommend this one. It was beautiful. Next up, gotta read this so I get it right. The Harder I Fight, the More I Love You, a memoir by Neko. Neko is one of my favorite musical artists. My best friend X introduced me to her years and years ago, and I've been obsessed ever since. This memoir that she's come out with, the title is the same as her most recent or second to most recent album release. And it's fantastic. Neko has this beautifully lyrical way of writing that's also incredibly dry. She's matter of fact while still being poetical. I think that's true in her songwriting, and I think that's true in her writing. Jeff surprised me for a date night a few months ago. She was coming to Rough Trade, which is a record store here in London, and doing readings and signings. So I went to get copies of this book for myself and for X. And finally got around to reading it. It was beautiful. Highly recommend. Next up, I read Pure Innocent Fun, Essays by Ira Madison III. Ira Madison is a well-known writer. He's a Black American writer, a pop culture raconteur and opinionator, and this basically covered all of his greatest hits. Specific pop culture moments to kind of document his own burgeoning self-awareness as a young gay man, what specific moments meant within the culture broadly and to him personally. He's an incredibly personable writer. There's a reason he's a successful writer and podcaster. He tells stories in the most lovely and engaging way. I think there's about 16 essays in this book altogether, so if you want something that you can get through fairly quickly but in good chunks, this was a great place to start. Highly recommend if you love pop culture. And I love pop culture. Next up, I read Cleavage, Men, Women, and the Space Between Us by Jennifer Finney Boylan. This was fantastic. This is a book by a trans woman, and she writes about being a trans woman before the current version of the culture wars. She came out and transitioned a while ago. I'll put some dates or something on the screen here if I can find them. But she is not necessarily of the current cultural moment. She's married to a woman, married her years ago, pre-transition. They have children together. So her whole family went through this transition experience and had to learn how to become a different kind of family. And unlike a lot of trans people in the current moment, she writes really openly and without, as far as I read it, without a degree of internalized shame about her pre-transition life as a man. Some trans people are very, very keen to not allow their pre-transition life to reflect them in post-transition. I'm sure I'm butchering this language, but they want to be taken on their own terms, which I wholly respect, and I try to be very careful of that in my day-to-day life. But what I found really interesting about this book is that the author writes very candidly of her experiences as a man becoming a woman, or as a man who wasn't a man but had the formative experiences of a man, and then transitioned into her womanhood after having had these foundational boyhood experiences. That's just not language that is used as much in the current versions of the trans experience and trans narratives. And for that reason, I found this a fantastic, fantastic exploration of gender from someone who has openly said, I've lived both versions of this. I lived life as a man, and now I live life as a woman. And here are the foundational differences of the world as I experience it. Here's how my family experienced this change. I'm so grateful for writing like this, because even though it's been heated up to a culture war almost entirely in a bigoted and anti-trans and anti-LGBT way in our current moment, trans people have always been with us. We have records of this. General Custer's washerwoman in the Union Army, turns out, was a trans woman. There is famously, for my fellow medievalists, the story of a medieval London prostitute who was born male, assigned male, we would say these days, but lived as a woman, worked as a prostitute as a woman, dressed and used female names in public. And her, it's kind of hard to apply current language to that. The court records reflect this. Like, we have examples of people choosing to live lives differently to the body that they were placed in and the time in which they were placed. This is not a new thing, people. Anyone who says that it is fucking telling on themselves. But I stand by what I said. I want to read more widely about the spectrum, I think, of trans experience over the course of my lifetime and because the culture and the language and the narratives around trans experience have undergone some fundamental changes. And writers like this are useful context for me in tracing that, because the author traces it. The author traces their experience of the changing trans landscape around them, because she transitioned before the current hullabaloo. And again, bad faith, bigoted attacks on the trans community. And her willingness to be so open about that and to write so candidly of the gendered experience of male and female and the transition period between was really, really insightful. I really appreciated it. Next up, I continued with my forays into the world of AI and read Codependent, Living in the Shadow of AI by Madhumita Murgia. She is a UK-based journalist, and this has been such a good companion piece to some of the other books that I mentioned in my last dump. More Everything Forever, which has a pride place on my bookshelf now. Empire of AI, which I read earlier this year, but again, I think I'm going to do some kind of end-of-year roundup because it was brilliant. This book was about the social impacts of AI and the social impacts and assumptions that are going into building the technology and how it's being applied. Empire of AI was very much, I think, a business insider, not insider, but a business perspective. More Everything Forever was much more about the tech industry writ large, with a focus on AI as the emergent tech. But Codependent is about the impact of these kind of technologies, the tech industry and AI, on people now. How it's changed, the seismic shifts, who is made safer, who is made less safe by these new technologies. Golly, this was such a good sociological read, to talk about the current, age of digital feudalism that we're starting to really come to terms with and grapple with, thank God. One of the case studies that she opens with is just how AI can be used maliciously and at scale. And because she's a woman, writing from the perspective of a woman, she writes about how it's being used specifically in the world of generative porn. And it's fascinating. Some of the things that she talks about, have to go to my notes here because it's grim. Programs to strip women, programs to cover women back up after they've been stripped, to simulate sex scenes, to create scenes of actual sex crimes. Yes, revenge porn, but also images of underage children. Instant duplication and proliferation, and of course, no consent whatsoever. She also goes into other areas of where tech brain thinking has good intentions, but does not think through the implications of its application and how that can affect the very people they claim to wanting to help. A really good example of this kind of poor thinking is predictive policing. Now, there have been any number of dystopian fictions created about this, but she goes through some examples of where predictive policing has been rolled out and has not had the intended effects. It doesn't prevent crime, and she goes through some case studies of how it actually creates criminals, i.e. it takes people who, once they have committed some kind of infraction, usually as children, they become, they become a data point to the state. And the scrutiny placed on them and the additional burdens of that scrutiny that impacts their ability to get a job, to live places, to do any number of things, furthers them down the likelihood of criminality later in life. So the predictive policing doesn't actually measure whether or not a person turns out to be a criminal. But because of the added burdens of policing on individuals makes them more likely to become criminals. Does that make sense? Something that I really, really love that Murgia just draws out in her questioning is that things like AI or code-dependent technologies like this fail to ask fundamental questions in this sort of example, which is, what do you want a justice system to do? Do you want it to prevent crime? Do you want it to rehabilitate people who might be prone to criminality and get them off that path? Or do you just want to punish those people and push them out of society? Because if you fail to actually ask the second and third order implication questions of your technology solution, you are building in a likely outcome. And her book just goes through example of example of example of how people building these technologies with very, very blue sky thinking don't ask the follow-up question, don't ask the implication question, or are unwilling to be challenged on their own assumptions of whether or not they should even be doing what they're tasked with doing. And of course, very similar to Karen Ho's excellent book, Empire of AI, she also details the opaqueness of how AI is being built and the actual huge amounts of human labor that goes into creating predictive models. Who is shouldering the burden of that labor? Mostly disadvantaged and poorer people. She also goes into examples of how gig work, whether it's to create the programs or then to run them, like with Uber, like with any other delivery app, also punishes the gig workers. But the more data that it collects, the more it can squeeze workers on pricing. A book that I read this month, so I'll have to do a deep dive on this later, that relates to this is Enshittification by Cory Doctorow. And he gives an example of how apps like Uber have been shown to strategically put their thumb on the scale for different drivers to get better jobs in such a way that the people who say yes to more jobs are paid less. So instead of being rewarded for working hard, the technology learns that this is a person that's desperate for work effectively and therefore can be paid less to extract more labor from them. This is true at the level of building these technologies as well. And Murgia goes into that in some amazing detail. She is an FT journalist. I'm probably not giving her enough credit as the author. This is a really, really good book, again, about the sociological implications of a code-dependent world as we've built it, and the implications and assumptions that have been built in, or are being built into the world, that we're perhaps, or not perhaps, we're definitely not fully cognizant of and not grappling with quickly enough. Recommend. All right, moving on, moving ahead. What else did I read? I read Heretic, Jesus Christ and the Other Sons of God by Catherine Nixey. Again, because of the hashtag discourse of what's going on in American politics and elsewhere that affects me, I've been doing a lot of reading on early Christianity. I mean, I've always been interested in this, and I've took coursework on it at university, and of course my degree was in medieval history, which draws very strongly on the ancient world and the rediscoveries of the ancient writings and texts during the medieval period, which then turned into the Renaissance. This book is fantastic because what Nixey does is she lays out how Christianity as we have received it could have gone any number of wild and wacky ways. Because in the first century AD, there wasn't one solid, solidified Christianity. There were lots of different variations and groups. There were lots of different collections of writings, some of which are downright wacky, like the Gospels that didn't make it into canon about Jesus Christ as a young boy just straight up committing murders in Nazareth because he's learning how to control his powers. It's very anime. The process of which books and which writings were preserved and why and by whom and for what reason, and oh golly, this is a really, really good examination of how the Jesus movement, which is a somewhat out of term but still in use way of referring to the early Christian movements, how the Jesus movement before it became Christianity was not one thing. It was a bunch of wild and wacky things, often in tension with one another, often with wildly different interpretations of who Jesus of Nazareth was, what his message was, what it wasn't. And she points out that there were other people who used the title of the Son of God during this period. She opens the book reciting a narrative of someone who, had a miraculous birth and, was a miracle worker and blah, blah, blah. And then she points out that it wasn't Jesus of Nazareth, because Jesus of Nazareth was just one of many people with this kind of narrative at this time period. She's a fantastic writer. She's British, she's very witty, and she's got just that very, very dry way of delivering things that is just textbook British academic. Turns out she was the daughter of a former nun and a former monk who left their first vocations to marry. And she talks about, growing up in an ultra-religious, ultra-conservative kind of household and how that informed, her learning and her interests. And she just has these wonderful throwaway lines, like she was always very suspicious of Halloween because it seemed both very wicked and very American. Beautiful. Love it. Anyway, if you're at all interested in Christian history, like me, this is another good one for the reading pile. This is another good one to appreciate the many variations of the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth and his contemporaries, and which ones did and didn't turn into a crystallized, formalized religion. And if you are a believer, I think it's important history to know how we got the texts that we have. And if you are not a believer, it's good to know what got left out and why. Either way, it's a really thoughtful way to inform your worldview of major world religion, which probably affects you. Next up, I read In This Economy, How Money and Markets Really Work by Kyla Scanlon. Kyla Scanlon is a millennial writer, and she writes a fantastic newsletter. Highly recommend. I'll link it in the description box thingy. She's also prolific on podcasts and other places. She's a very, very current voice. And I think she's necessary because this book, if I could describe it, it's an accessible millennial textbook. It's an economics textbook for people who didn't do an economics course in university. I didn't do an economics course. What she does is she just explains terminologies. She summarizes theories. She summarizes whole economic ways of thinking. A lot of this book is just definitions, but again, in an accessible way for a modern, current, non-expert reader. I liked this book. I knew a lot of the information already in it, so I didn't learn a ton from it, but I still found it a really, really good read, a really good primer, and probably, again, for a lot of people who don't have an education or basis in economics and want to start at square one, this is probably a good place to start to understand what various terms mean, how they're used in current parlance. Golly, there's a lot in it that if you just understand the terminology, you'll understand the policy better, and she explains policies in really accessible ways. She has a point of view, she's very open about her point of view, and she's very, very clear about when she's being opinionated versus when she's being educational. She's a very accessible writer. I'd like to see more from her in the future that's not so much educational, but is more like what she does in the newsletter, where she does deep dives into specific topics or explores specific policy solutions. She touches on that in some places in this, but that's not what this book is about. But yeah, it's also just very of the moment in this economy. This is a book for millennials and Gen Z, who are, if you're an elder millennial like me, on the cusp of our fourth or fifth, major economic life event. And if you're Gen Z, possibly just gearing up for your first or second one. First time. Aha, I said I would get back to this. The next book I read, Enshittification, Why Everything Suddenly Got Worse and What to Do About It by Cory Doctorow. If you at all listen to any of the rants that I do, you've probably read his work before. Cory Doctorow coined the term enshittification, on a Medium post that went viral a couple of years ago. And it was his term to describe a specific process in which things get worse in a very specific way. He himself is very generous. He knows that this term has been picked up by any number of outlets or any number of users to just refer to things are getting, worse for consumers. And he's not wrong. But this book is a specific accounting of how it has happened in the business and tech worlds. And the first half of it truly is just example after example after example of how specific big name companies enshittified. The best example, of course, is Facebook. Something that started out as a free to use product that had very limited uses and capacities, but has inverted such that we, the users, if you still use it, are now the product. how our attention is being sold off, but specifically sold off in ways that are harmful and bad for us, not just on a societal level, but also, practically. Another good example of this is Amazon. He goes into how Amazon's pricing models and how they have specifically structured their business deals means that vendors who sell from them have to sell at a certain price, and they can't sell it for lower. So if it's benchmarked at a certain place on Amazon, you're paying the same at Tesco, if not more. So how the consolidation of power and how the consolidation of attention and how the consolidation of capital is making products that are harder to use, that we cannot get out of using even if we want to, and how the specific laws and regulations of mostly the United States have made it impossible to really challenge some of these tools on copyright law or on IP infringement. An example he uses all the time is printer ink, and how if you want to buy printer ink, the way that certain models are set up, you have to buy the specific ink from the specific supplier. And if you don't buy it, in this right kind of cartridge that plugs into this machine and a microchip gets read to confirm that it's that kind of ink, your printer simply won't work, thereby removing your choice as a consumer. He is a prolific writer. He's also a fiction writer. And he is currently on the book tour for this book. So it's definitely worth reading or listening to any of the number of podcast interviews or pieces that he's writing in support of this. He's a really, really humorous writer. He's very, very engaging. But this is a book that will make you mad, and it should. He has some views that I don't entirely agree with around certain applications of technologies. But I think that the core basis of his argument is fundamentally correct, that the monopolization of everything is bad for society. It's leading to worse products. It's giving us as consumers and creators fewer and fewer choices. And it's selling us solutions to problems that the technologies themselves create, and not giving us enough off-ramps. He's making the case at time of recording in the media that the various decisions of the Trump administration are actually creating a potentially post-American internet, because he points out that the vast majority of the platforms, tools, services, vendors, what have you, that power the modern internet are, of course, American products. But as the Trump administration has become less and less desirable to do business with and to kowtow to, that organizations like the European Union or other areas, that's just one that happens to affect me more directly, even though Brexit, has the ability, or is giving different blocks of countries or different coalitions an opportunity to challenge American homogeny in this space, which I think is really interesting, because it will come with upsides and it will come with downsides, which he completely agrees. But I don't know. It's worth listening to some of his recent talks on this. They're definitely thought-provoking. But again, the core thesis that platforms start as beneficial to their users and then make specific business decisions to become less and less good, useful, relevant, proactive, and protective in ways that actually end up harming their users is damn sound. And again, extrapolated, I think can really just articulate so many things about our current moment, our current economy, our current political system, just everything. This book's worth it. Next up, I read Stephen Fry's Odyssey. I actually listened to this in audiobook because Stephen Fry is a fantastic audiobook narrator. This is the fourth in his cycle, Mythos, Heroes, Troy, and the Odyssey. Oh golly, again, just Stephen Fry. What can one say but Stephen Fry? He's taking his beloved Greek myths through the entirety of the Mythos cycle, from creation to kind of the formation of the Athenian legal system and the sort of traditional closing of the mythic age of heroes, which closes with Odysseus's return. So, beautiful, beautiful narration. All of Fry's normal witticisms and clever turns of phrase, and just, the man loves language, and so listening to him talk is a joy. In the realm of public health, I read Red Madness, How a Medical Mystery Changed What We Eat by Gail, Jarrow. This is a book about the spread of pellagra, which is a disease I had never heard of, and the public health campaign to identify what it was, what caused it, and how to eradicate it in the United States. You can tell that this was written post-COVID and is really, really relevant to the post-COVID world. This was a good read. It was a quick read. It wasn't the most engaging piece of public health writing I've ever read, but Jarrow tells a really, really good story about how this disease, which is fundamentally a disease of poverty, based on food restrictions of poverty in the South, the American South, led to this, really horrific condition, which caused rashes, which could cause, descent into madness and suicidality and all kinds of stuff. But again, was fundamentally a disease based in food and poverty. And the public health campaign to study it, to identify the factors, the many mistakes made along the way, the assumptions made about what this disease was, what caused it, and how to treat it. And the challenges then of convincing people who did not want to be convinced that their diet or their culture or or social conditions contributed to this, because they felt that it reflected poorly on them or their politics or their culture. I had never heard of this disease, and it sounds really harrowing. And if you have ever wondered why we eat fortified grains, this is why. It's worth educating yourself. But again, I could not help but read this post-COVID and feel very strongly about the resistance to the scientific evidence that had accumulated around this, and how to treat it, and how some people simply didn't want to know better, or didn't want to behave differently, or were so dedicated to rejecting the conclusions of science. It's great to know so much has changed. On that note, I then read The Viral Underclass, The Human Toll When Inequality and Disease Collide by Stephen W. Thrasher. This is exactly what it says on the tin. This is public health writing about the conditions that cause disease, how inequalities of various types contribute. Dr. Thrasher explores how the fault lines of privilege and who falls through the cracks of them are key to understanding how diseases develop and how they spread. He uses his specific background in studying HIV and its spread to explore this topic. It's not limited to just HIV, but I think that's where some of the most powerful stories come from. Of course, he talks about COVID. He talks about other viruses as well. But the theme is specifically who is most harmed by public health outbreaks. What are the material conditions that exacerbate those harms? Who is insulated from those harms and why? And the role that various kinds of privilege play in protecting some people and leaving others more exposed goes into making diseases spread. It's not a fun read, but I think it's an important one. And then finally, to round it all off, I read Replaceable You, Adventures in Human Anatomy by Mary Roach. Mary Roach is, probably one of the reigning queens of science writing. This book is about literally the life and afterlife of various human parts. Roach explores how the limitations of the human body, its finiteness, the fact that, for most of our history, if you lost a limb, you lost a limb, and you had to deal with it or die. But what it means now in the world where we have increasing options when it comes to prosthetics, how things like the development of reconstructive and plastic surgery post-World War I changed the surgical game, how things like iron lungs helped us to overcome polio, and what it means to actually live in one of them. She's a fantastic writer. She's witty, she's clever, and her kind of writing involves just delving into a topic full-throatedly, wholeheartedly, and putting herself experientially into the circumstances that she wants to report on. I love her writing. I think I've read all of her books. This one about the weirdness of the human body, how we are now able to remove and replace various bits of ourselves, what the next leap in technology for that might be, is wonderful writing. All right, children, gather around. It's time for Auntie C's Smut Corner. Yes, I read so much filth over the last couple of months, and I regret nothing. As usual, I'll put it all on the screen. Some highlights, though. I delved into Lissa Lemire's Hot Shots series, read the whole thing, finished Sarah Smith's Denver Bashers series. Standout. Ali Hazelwood's latest, Mate, which is a follow-up to her novel Bride, which came out a couple of years ago. Loved it. Ali Hazelwood, for those who don't know, got her start in fanfic community, as so many writers did, and she, after writing wonderful, women in STEM-based romances, I have a bunch on my shelf, has gone back to her monster-loving roots. Bride was a vampire novel, Mate is a werewolf novel. They're great. I love them. She's a fantastic writer. She also contributed to an anthology of short stories, which so I read her novella Hot for Slayer, which is another vampire novella. It was great. Read some filth by Chloe Main, Brittany Nicole, her latest in her Boston Bolts hockey. A new to me writer, Lucy Darling, not the comedienne, I don't believe, but read her New Rain series. It was fine. Let's see what else. Helena Hunting, her latest in her Toronto Terror series, which I really liked. I really like Helena Hunting, so can definitely recommend that. Other standouts, though, Becca Mack's Breathe With Me, which is the 5th in her Playing for Keeps series, and was really, really lovely. It deals with struggles with infertility, which was handled really, really beautifully. And unlike a lot of romance novels, which is about people, getting together, this was about a married couple, a really well and happily partnered married couple, going through infertility and the struggles of that. So it's not always a topic you see in the romance genre, but I loved her handling of it, and she writes fantastic characters, so that was a standout. Another one that I read that stood out to me was Love is Blind by Annabelle Costa. And this one stood out because it deals with disfigurement. Quite often there is, the more popular trope in the romance genre, particularly for like historical romance, what have you, is the scarred hero. Um, Love me some of that. Don't get me wrong, it's OG. But this one is different in the sense that the hero, or the male main character, is a war vet who has gone blind, but the character dealing with deformity is the woman, who was severely burned as a child, and this has informed her experience with the world and how she moves through it, and how things like physical beauty do and don't matter whether or not you're sighted. Like how society treats people who are disabled or who are deformed in some way. So yeah, that one, Breathe With Me, and Mate, standout romances of the last 2 months. Yeah, that was Auntie's Smut Corner. Yeah, not as many books, but that's because I was traveling around Japan, and I regret nothing. Truly, did I film this whole thing with like a timestamp on it? I'm so bad at this.